today's subject is, well, aliens, sort of. Not the UFO, UAP stuff. We've covered that already, but the actual search for extraterrestrial intelligence, technosignatures, biosignatures, the real science stuff. This episode was triggered by a paper I read that came out in Science Advances called A Reassessment of the Hard Steps Model for the Evolution of Intelligent Life. Hard steps model is that it's hard to get from bacteria to big brains, and so there's too many steps, so we're probably either alone or very rare. My guest today begged to differ, and they wrote a long piece on this. There's Daniel Mills, co-authored by Daniel Mills and Jennifer Macalady. Is that right, Jennifer Macalady? Did I pronounce that? I should have asked you that before we started recording. Okay, good.
The St. Louis branch would approve.
Okay. So Daniel Mills coming to us from Germany. He's in Munich, Germany. He has a bachelor's in science and geobiology from Penn State and a PhD in biochemistry from the University of Southern Denmark. He's currently a postdoc researcher in the Orsi Geomicrobiology Lab at the University of Munich in Germany. And his research primarily focuses on the co-evolutionary history of Earth's surface environment and eukaryotic life. We'll get into what the difference is between prokaryote and eukaryote in a moment, but this is a complex life, the cells that you and I are made out of. A topic he approaches by studying modern marine organisms and environments. He also applies this research to the ongoing search for exoplanetary biosignatures and technosignatures. And then Jennifer Macalady has a BA in geology from Carleton College and a PhD in soil microbiology from the University of California, Davis. She's currently a professor of geosciences in the Penn State University lab there, and researcher focuses on microbial ecology and evolution. Sorry, I'm reading too fast. And interactions between microorganisms and earth materials like minerals and water through geological time. My old job. Okay, both of them are affiliated with the Penn State Extraterrestrial Intelligence Center. This is how I got interested in talking to them, because we love this subject, which is dedicated to advancing the search for extraterrestrial technological life in the universe via technosignatures. All right, let's get started. How did you guys get into this? Jennifer, you start us off first. How did you get interested in the search for aliens, as it were?
Well, in my mind, aliens are also microbes. They're probably the most abundant aliens. And so I'm a microbiologist, and so I have a long association with the Penn State Astrobiology Research Center, which I'm directing now. And when Jason asked me what I thought about the hard steps model one day in a casual conversation, I said, I have no idea. Tell me what it is. Because it's something that astronomers really are familiar with. And so when he told me, I thought, that sounds really strange to me. And I had to think about it a lot. And we started having a more deeper conversation about it. So Jason Wright is an astronomer at Penn State. And I brought in Dan Mills because I thought he would be the ideal person to make a bridge between the astronomers and astrophysicists and the geoscientists.
Nice. Dan?
So I was actually in Jen's lab at Penn State when I was an undergrad. So at Penn State, I was a geobiology major, but I was also able to minor in astrobiology. And Penn State was super active in astrobiology research at that time. And I ate it up, and I loved working in Jen's lab. Then I kind of forgot about astrobiology during my PhD. My work primarily focused on the Earth and Earth's deep past. And until Jen brought me into these conversations, like in 2021 or so, I hadn't worked on astrobiology. I hadn't actually published anything, but I was familiar with this hard steps model. And actually, in the beginning, when they brought me into these conversations, I was a big hard steps model advocate. I agreed with it, and I was the only one who really agreed with it. And it was through a series of these conversations and thinking about it that I was thinking, if the hard step model isn't true, how do we explain these observations, and what would the alternative be? So my mind has changed a lot in the past few years, but even in the back of my mind during my PhD, I was thinking about the hard steps model. I find it very engaging.
Nice. Well, maybe that's a good place to start. After I first dispel the the other part of this story. That is to say, you guys can stand down because we already know about aliens. They're here. And the government's hiding them, and Trump's about to release all the secret documents and files, and Marco Rubio is going to go to Area 51 and show us what they have. I don't think that's very likely, and I presume you guys are skeptical of the whole UFO, UAP accounts as well.
Yeah, especially this.
In a word.
Especially this ongoing flap that started with the New York Times cover story. Particularly skeptical of everything surrounding that.
Yeah, it's irritating because people will say, well, the New York Times says they're real, or the government says they're real. It's like, no, the New York Times article was by Leslie Kean, who's a pro-ufologist. And when they say they're real, they mean the videos. They're not fake CGI videos. The videos are real, but they're blurry, grainy videos, is always the case. So, in other words, I guess the best way to summarize it is that in terms of a level of scientific evidence that you would accept for this extraordinary claim, it doesn't reach the level where you'd say, yes, we have a hit.
I agree with that.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So, but the question, of course, the interest is because, I don't know, why is there such an interest? It's like roots writ large. It's where do we come from? How did life get here? Is there somebody else out there? Do they know we're here? Could we find them? That kind of stuff, right?
Yeah, it's our communal origin story, and who's not interested in that? Like, where do we come from is one of the most wondrous questions you can imagine.
And so we have an N of 1. That's all we know for sure. So that's why your training here on studying microbial life on Earth is important, because that's all we know so far. And so you take that as a model. So how does that? Maybe Dan, if you want to review the hard steps model, going all the way back to when Brandon Carter first outlined this. When was that, in the 60s or something like that?
Yeah, the hard steps model was formalized in a paper he published in 1983.
Oh, 83.
But it's an application of his anthropic reasoning. So he coined and developed the concept of the anthropic principle. And what he did is he applied it to Earth's biological evolution. And it all started by comparing different time scales. So he first looked at the total time that's available for biological evolution on Earth, and he used the main sequence lifetime of the sun for that. So that's the period of the sun's life where it will burn hydrogen in its core, and it's presumably going to leave the main sequence in 5 billion years or so. And he assumed that's an upper limit for Earth's habitability. Once the sun goes to the next phase of its life, the Earth will no longer be hospitable. So we have like a 10 billion year window. And then he looked at the time it took for us to emerge, which is roughly equivalent to the age of the Earth as we observe it now, because we're so geologically recent. And that's a little less than 5 billion years. So essentially his question is, why did we evolve so close in time to the extinction of the biosphere? To a physicist, 5 billion and 10 billion are very similar numbers. They differ by only... Yeah, it's funny. I never thought that was funny as a geology undergrad. That never struck me as a coincidence, even though we were taught the same time scales. But to him, it was a coincidence that needed an explanation, in the sense that they're different by only like a factor of 2. 5 times 2 is 10. They're within the same order of magnitude. And you can imagine scenarios, which he did, like, why don't we find ourselves on a much younger Earth? And he invoked something. He proposed that there's like an average expected time it takes for intelligent life like ourselves to evolve. We don't know what this is, and evolutionary biologists can't predict it. So he tried to constrain it just by going through different possibilities. So in the first possibility, the expected average time is small, like it's only millions of years or tens of millions of years. This is an order of magnitude different, or if it's hundreds of millions of years, this is very different than billions of years. And he ruled that out because if that were true, we should find ourselves on a much younger Earth. Why did it take so long for us? And he also said he couldn't think of anything that could have delayed our origin. And we'll talk about that later, I'm sure. But that's how he thought about it then. So he said possibility one can't be true. Then the second possibility is the expected average time is 5 billion years, where we find ourselves in Earth's history up until now. And he ruled that out as a too unlikely coincidence that he would only consider if the remaining possibility were unlikely. And the remaining possibility is that the average expected time to evolve intelligence is much greater than the time given to biological evolution on Earth. So imagine it's hundreds of billions of years on average or something like that. And then this is where the anthropic reasoning comes in, because even if that's the expected average time, it's not impossible for life to arise, or intelligent life to arise much more quickly than that. And obviously we exist on Earth now. And if we are going to exist on Earth, we can only exist while it's habitable. We're not going to find ourselves, on the Earth after the sun leaves the main sequence. So in this case, when intelligent life does evolve within this 10 billion year time frame, you would expect it to most likely appear after a great portion of the total time available has elapsed. And that's what we observe. And to him, that satisfied him as an explanation for this coincidence between 10 billion years and 5 billion years. If the expected average time is much greater than 10 billion years, but nevertheless we exist, we should expect to find ourselves in time close to the extinction of the biosphere. And he was satisfied with that logic, so he concluded first, the average expected time to intelligence is much greater than the time that the Earth has to support biological evolution. And then to explain that why does it take so long, he invoked something called hard steps, and he surmised that somewhere in our evolutionary history, like from the transition from non-life to where we are now, there must have been, at that time, he thought either one or two steps that needed to happen for us to be here. Like if these things had never happened, we wouldn't be here talking about this. And they're expected, or they have a very low probability of happening within the time limit, the external time limit themselves. So maybe the average expected time would be billions of years. And the Earth is lucky in that it was able to successfully complete these transitions in the available time. And that means we're one of the exceptional cases where life has unfolded uncharacteristically rapid, and here we are before that the sun renders the Earth inhospitable. That's how we thought about it originally in 1983. And then that's the formalization of the hard steps model.
Yeah. And so the reason your paper is necessary, is, would you say, is because most of your colleagues agree with this hard steps model, and therefore you're revising that.
So it's really interesting. Jen mentioned this. A lot of people in our field, so I consider myself a historical geobiologist. We study the co-evolutionary history of life and Earth's surface environment. So the climate, the atmosphere, the ocean, so on. I don't think, maybe there's a few exceptions. So Andy Knoll at Harvard wrote a paper on the hard steps. Actually, it was like an obscure book chapter. I discovered it only while writing the paper. He wrote it in the 80s. And then Tim Lenton and Andy Watson in the UK, both at the University of Exeter, they wrote a book that was a combination of the Carter's anthropic reasoning, the hard steps model, interwoven with the Gaia hypothesis. So Andy Watson and Tim Lenton both worked under Jim Lovelock of Gaia hypothesis fame. But for the most part, it's ignored a lot. And Andy Knoll was skeptical. Andy Watson is definitely a hard steps advocate. Most other people don't write about it in the literature, but and I know you've written about this in historical or in evolutionary biology, even before Carter wrote his argument, you had like architects of the modern synthesis like George Gaylord Simpson or Ernst Mayr, and they did talk about, like, is SETI likely to succeed? And they all said no. They're all very skeptical of SETI, and they had their own reasons. It wasn't Carter's reasoning, but actually their reasoning and Carter's reasoning are very compatible. But there's different traditions involved, different fields. So the evolutionary biologists have their way of thinking about it. Like Jen said, it's mostly astronomers and physicists who talk about the hard steps model. They have their way of thinking about this. And this is the thing, the people best suited to evaluate the the foundational assumptions of the hard steps model, they're earth scientists and people who study the deep evolutionary history of life on Earth, and they've been historically unengaged. So it's primarily motivated to get them on board. Like, hey, I think you'd be interested in this. Your research has a lot of implications for this model, whether or not it's true. And that was one of at least my intentions, to get them involved.
Yeah.
But I will say, going into this, I was an advocate of the hard steps model.
Interesting.
And I think that people who thought about it, I thought it had to be true. And I see that certainty in other hard steps advocates. But again, I don't think, only very few of my colleagues were thinking about it.
You guys should do a book. I mean, your paper is so good and comprehensive and well written and clear. You cover all the big topics: the Drake equation, the Fermi Paradox, the Great Filter, the Great Silence, the rare Earth hypothesis, the major transitions in evolution, how unique are humans, biosignatures, technosignatures. I mean, there's all your chapter heads right there. So I recommend doing that.
Thank you.
Your co-author,
Thanks
Adam,
for the love.
just published his book on this subject, and I had Sarah Walker on her on her new book about redefining the origins of life. But Jen, maybe
it's inevitable that we write a book.
Yeah, you got to do it.
Sure. Yeah.
Jen, can you give us kind of an overview for people not familiar with the literature on this, on kind of the big picture? When did life first arise? I mean, whatever the latest theory is on the origins of life, the very, very crudest, even before prokaryotic cells. And then where did the eukaryotic cells that we're made out of come from? Are these, conglomerates of these simpler prokaryotic cells? And so how do you get all the way up to big brains?
Wow. Okay. So the origin of life is still shrouded in mist. There's lots of progress and interest in this field right now, and it's becoming more interdisciplinary, I would say, which I think is a plus for progress. There are still multiple ideas about the origin of life, and so ... Once life arose, there was an evolution that led to two main branches, which separated very early in the origin of life. So life emerged sometime between the time that liquid water was stable on the Earth's surface, which according to isotopic evidence and zircons was around 4.4 billion years ago, and the time when we have the first widely accepted fossils of microbial life in the form of stromatolites, and those are about 3.8 billion years, 3.5, 3.8. There's some isotopic evidence that's more controversial at 3.8 billion years ago. And the first stromatolites that are widely accepted as evidence for life are a little bit younger, 3.5 billion years. So sometime in that window, 4.4 to 3.5, which is a long window, life emerged and began to diversify, and two types of cells emerged, bacteria and archaea. And those two types of cells have very distinct biochemistry. There's no confusing them. That's not controversial. For a very long time, life was single-celled and prokaryotic, meaning the DNA in the cells was not enclosed in its own separate membrane. That membrane is called the nuclear membrane in our cells, and it's a hallmark of eukaryotic life. The eukaryotes can be single-celled, but they have a more complex organization that involves some endosymbionts. And so eukaryotic cells are essentially a fusion of different cells that used to live separately and at very early in Earth's history fused. And for example, our mitochondria have their own DNA and their own diseases, actually, which is a really important insight for human health. So when eukaryotic cells arose, this fusion product, brilliant, right? Totally brilliant. Two completely different kinds of cells merging and, pulling their genius. Those cells started to emerge into multicellularity. And so animal multicellularity is something that Dan is much more facile with than I am, because I think multicellular things are too big to be interesting. And So multicellularity emerged in a variety of lineages, but animal multicellularity is something very special. And animals and a lot of eukaryotes, actually, not all, but many, many eukaryotic cells require oxygen to breathe. And so in particular, animals require a lot of oxygen to breathe. And so those kinds of organisms could not evolve for most of Earth's history. So 8/9 of Earth's history, there wasn't enough oxygen for animals to breathe. And so animal evolution started to proceed after oxygen in the atmosphere rose to a level that would permit that kind of a lifestyle.
8/9 of the Earth's history was without oxygen. Is that what you said?
Yeah.
That's a long time. Okay, so because first you said, well, there's a long span between, the Earth is 4.6 billion years old, and the earliest life 3.8 billion years. Yeah, that's a long stretch of time, hundreds of millions of years. But on the other hand, that's pretty early in the Earth's history.
That's right. So Earth, what is amazing to me as a microbiologist and an Earth historian is that life seemed to emerge as early as it could, within the limits of our ability to determine when it did exactly arise. I mean, very soon, geologically speaking, after liquid water was stable on Earth's surface, life emerged. And so that's something that I thought a lot about long before I ever heard about the hard steps model. I should clarify that there was oxygen in the Earth's atmosphere about halfway through Earth's history, but it was at a too low of a level to support animal breathing. And so the second rise of oxygen was only 500 million years ago. And that was the transition that allowed animals to evolve.
Right.
Or in some tellings of the story.
I see. Mm-hmm. I once spent a week in the Galapagos Islands with Lynn Margulis and a bunch of other evolutionary biologists. And
wonderful.
Oh yeah, she was quite a character. She's something of a professional contrarian. Everybody there
Absolutely.
was kind of a neo-Darwinist, and so she decided, I'm not a neo-Darwinist, and here's why you're wrong. It was quite interesting.
The great thing about Lynn is that she's been right, in a couple of spectacular ways. And so she has every right to her skepticism.
Yes, absolutely. At least to get a hearing for whatever her views are. One of them,
well, that's the thing about science, right? Everybody should get a hearing.
Yes. Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Okay. So, and so I guess here's a larger question. Do the laws of nature have built into them, I don't know, front-loaded or however you want to describe it, fine-tuned, to give rise to more complex structures so that it's, I wouldn't say not inevitable, but there's a push toward going from simple to complex for molecules to bind to one another, to go from prokaryote to eukaryote or, whatever, something like that?
I have some ideas about that.
Yeah.
Dan, do you want to tackle that first?
Well, that's a really good question. I mean, obviously, this doesn't answer it, but obviously it works. It happens. At least here, it happened. If there's anything pulling life in that direction, I don't know. I don't think so. Or that's outside the bounds of science right now, I would say. Because again, it's only certain lineages that have made these transitions. Like as Jen mentioned, one bacterial lineage and one archaeal lineage were involved in the origin of eukaryotes, but every other bacterial and archaeal lineage, at least that's alive today, has stayed in a prokaryotic state. So it's just really this one fusion event. Well, our paper touches on that a bit, if it really only happened once or not. And then, even going from the earliest eukaryotes to something like animals, something that our response to the hard steps model doesn't address, and the hard steps model doesn't address this either, is how do you explain these transitions in the first place? And this is, I think, in the purview of evolutionary biology. A lot of what we do in geobiology is try to figure out the environmental requirements of these transitions and when those requirements became established by Earth's surface environment in its deep past. So we try to figure out what it required, but it's much harder to figure out what was actively driving these transitions. Like each step, what was being selected for, what was encouraging it. I've worked a little bit on eukaryogenesis, and there are metabolic reasons why these two different cells would have been driven together, but there are a lot of cells that have these kinds of metabolic exchanges that never led to eukaryotes. So it's a bit of a mystery. So we primarily have tried to focus on what these transitions required and when they were met and when they will disappear in the future, because that will tell you the windows of opportunity within which these things can even happen. But how they happened and why they happened is still something we don't really know. But obviously a lot of people are working on it, but they're primarily, to my knowledge, evolutionary biologists.
Right.
That's right. And I think that there's an ecological answer to your question, Michael. I think that life is a dynamo that tries things until something opens a door. And it's given the amount of time, it's really hard for humans to grasp how much time evolution has had to cook on this problem.
Yeah.
And so, if this evolutionary dynamo, given enough time, what it's going to do is it's going to explore niche space. And the great thing about life is that as soon as you make one life form, that life form is in itself a dimension of some other life form's niche. So if you look at humans or any animal or any plant, we're just a walk-in home for microbes. I think it was Lewis Thomas who said, I'm here, something like I'm here sitting on my mitochondria are here causing my fingers to type this book out on this typewriter. And so I thought that's something I read when I was very young, and I've never forgotten it. So I think that one possible explanation that may still be in the realm of ecological philosophy, but one possible explanation for why life is driven toward complexity is that it's a positive feedback. As soon as you have an empty niche that's filled by some new innovation, that new life form provides a special, different, other kind of niche that may not even have existed before.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's one idea.
Right.
Yeah. I was just thinking of the problem of deep time. John McPhee's opening line in one of his books was the tip of Mount Everest is marine limestone.
It's great.
Yeah.
Put 29,000 feet up and it was once underwater. It's just inconceivable how deep that time is. Yeah, I know like creationists like to talk about the Cambrian explosion. It happened, practically overnight. But when you actually read the literature, just even the Wikipedia page, it's like tens of millions of years. Like, when geologists talk about an explosion, they mean something rather different.
They do.
That's true.
They do.
Yeah. Okay, so, and I wanted to ask about Sarah Walker's assembly theory. It's somebody else also that is working on that with her. I think it was her professor, maybe. Assembly theory. It's a little beyond my pay grade. But the point of her book, on which she came on the show to talk about, was that we need a new definition of life because what we have now is not getting us the answer to the origins of life problem. I don't know what to think about this. What if this is getting some tailwinds in the field of that you deal with on that question? Either of you?
So I'm personally not that familiar. I have her book over there, but I haven't read it yet.
Okay.
And I've never worked on the origin of life, and in a lot of ways, that's a field unto itself. There are a lot of people, and so I have to say I haven't read it, but I'm interested to learn more about it.
Yeah, I don't know, Jen, if you.
I do think about the origin of life, and there's two ways to come at it. There's the way of prebiotic chemistry, where you try to make life out of parts. And there's the Earth history approach, where you try to see back in time, either by looking at genes or by looking at fossils, to approach the origin of life that way. And when I said that field is becoming more interdisciplinary, I mean in part that there's a lot of different streams coming into the community that used to be very, very insular. And I think some of the most interesting strains actually are synergistic with what Dan and I are saying, in that life didn't just assemble out of inanimate parts. It was in an environment already before it was alive. And so I think a lot of the new strains are taken down into account, and I think progress is happening as a result.
Yeah. I guess the inevitability question that I'm getting at is that if it's fairly natural for these processes to happen around the cosmos, and pretty much every star of the 100 billion stars or however many it is in the Milky Way, hundreds of billions, I guess, then that's dozens of hundreds of billions of planets. You're just in no matter how many hard steps there are, it's inevitable there are going to be extraterrestrial life forms of all kinds out there, all over the place.
Yeah, I mean, this is the way some scientists feel, for sure. I mean, it all depends. The numbers. It all depends on the numbers.
Yeah.
So if it all depends on how rare is rare, and how hard is hard, and why. Is something that's improbable on Earth going to be equally improbable on another planet? I think there are a lot of unanswered questions, and I think certainly it's not time to say that life is rare. I think that there's not sufficient support for that argument to believe in that.
Yeah. Dan?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Like, when I was an undergrad, I was really taken by the rare earth hypothesis. So that is essentially the idea that it's relatively easy to originate life. So there might be, a good number of inhabited planets out there, but only a very small percentage of those planets will ever make the sort of transition that the Earth made a little more than 500 million years ago, where all this kind of macroscopic, multicellular, complex life began flourishing, and you have like multicellular animals and forests and these sorts of things. That's the rare earth hypothesis. But then the inverse is Simon Conway Morris's idea, where the origin of life is actually really hard, but once you get life, it's really easy to make the transition to animal life and then human-like life. And this is what happens when you have an N of 1, and then you can't, how do you tell the difference? Those are two very different ideas, all based on the same data set or data sets. How do you tell the difference between them? And that's not easy.
Yeah, the Simon Conway Morris, he was on the show and talking about convergent evolution. And it's rather in contrast to Steve Gould's, push for contingency and how, random everything is. And Gould was, he supported the SETI program, but he thought, it's unlikely that we'll find anything because there's just there's too many contingent steps. So you would think Simon Conway Morris talking about convergent evolution, this just happens, eyes and wings and fusiform bodies and so on, just form depending on the physics of the planet and so on. But he ends up coming out and saying, well, we're alone.
Right.
Which I thought was pretty peculiar.
Right. No, and that doesn't make sense at first glance when I heard that idea, but I think it's explained. He thinks the origin of life itself was hard. Is that how he comes to that? Okay, that's what I thought.
Yeah, I think so. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
It's been a while since I looked at that, but again, I mean, if you look at it like a game theory model, like once you move away from the left wall of simplicity and things start interacting, there's going to be a selective advantage to, cooperating or like symbiogenesis. Just these more complex cells are more likely to survive than the simpler cells. I mean, the reasoning is something like that, right?
Yeah,
that doesn't initially sound that appealing, because I teach a class in which we explore why is it that microbial cells are still so tiny? They've had 4 billion years to get big. If there was an advantage to getting bigger, they would have done it.
Oh, interesting.
And so I think it really comes back to this idea of, well, what's your niche? If you got your own niche, you're fine. The only problem is if you get in a niche where there's already competition, or competition comes in, and then you can get into trouble. But, microbes are small because it's a very successful niche.
I see. Yes, that's a great point. Yeah, because a lot of people make a big deal about human intelligence, and it's so superior. having big brains. Well, if it's so great, how come we're the only ones?
Right.
And
Exactly. That's a very compatible thought.
yeah.
Right.
I mean, that would be, I guess, part of the great filters. I mean, I guess the filters is that there's just no need to go further than wherever you are in the evolution. If you have a niche that's being fulfilled, just fine.
Right. Yeah. No, and it's funny, the great filter, that idea is actually inspired by the hard steps model. It builds off the hard steps model. And it's my understanding that there's somewhere between from non-life to a galaxy spanning technological civilization, there must be steps, a step or series of steps that act as this filter to prevent that trajectory from completion. But it's interesting because that idea, the starting point of the great filter is that we have no evidence for extraterrestrial intelligence. But the person who came up with the great filter, Robin Hanson, who's an economist, he believes that UAPs are literally extraterrestrial astronauts, are spaceships piloted by astronauts. But he preserves the great filter logic by arguing that they have a shared biological ancestry with us via panspermia. And that's his logic, as opposed to being, I guess the great filter is wrong because they're here. He doesn't do that. He preserves the original logic and finds this other way of explaining how, if it's so improbable and rare, how could it be that there are extraterrestrial astronauts in our airspace? And that's where he resorts to panspermia to explain it. But yeah, it's interesting.
I was not aware of that. That's really funny. Huh? Again, you just have an N of one. People just go off with their imaginations and draw out these thought experiments because that's all you could do. What about Paul Davies' idea of a second Genesis on Earth? Is that got any traction? Like, what would it take if you found a microorganism that had different DNA or different self-replicating molecules or something like that? Jen?
Well, there is a I mean, Paul Davies is a smart guy, and there's a way that we could be bamboozled, because when we go and look for DNA, we have a search image. So anytime you have a search image, you're likely to find something that matches your search image. And so weird life or cryptic life or any of these ideas about life that's here that we don't really know about, those kinds of arguments depend on sort of, we're missing it because we can't really, the life is not in our search image, and that's why we don't see it. And I hear that argument. In the case of DNA, which was your example, Michael, I think that, it would have to be something like, because we're really good at finding DNA. Like, we now find DNA that's ancient. We now find DNA that belongs to lineages that are in different phyla from things that we ever found before. And it's true that all of those bits of DNA fit into this tree that's a family tree, meaning that we all had a common ancestor. Now, if there was a different informational molecule that allowed evolution in a cryptic or weird life form, we could miss that. I think it's getting increasingly rare that we would miss it, just because our techniques for finding these informational molecules are getting more sophisticated through time.
Yeah. Dan, you want to come in on that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I remember learning about this idea of the shadow biosphere while I was an undergrad at Penn State. And if we found a second example of life originating on Earth, it would certainly undermine the idea that the origin of life itself was a hard step, that it was unlikely to happen while the Earth is still habitable. If it happened twice, it can't be that improbable. But yeah, I think it would be hard to look for it if your usual ways of detecting DNA would not, if these other organisms have a different informational molecule that would not respond to the same things, then you could potentially overlook it. But I wonder if it did exist, if there would be other ways of identifying it. I don't know. Yeah, it depends on what they look like. And yeah, I don't know. If they made biofilms or something, you'd still be able to see them, but maybe they don't do that, or I don't know.
Yeah, we're sort of assuming that this other life form is microscopic,
right?
Because we don't see it. Yeah,
I guess part of the problem is that if there was a bunch of different experiments in that time between 4.6 billion and 3.8 billion years ago, it's all erased in the rock cycle, right? It's gone.
Well, that's really interesting because of course, the earliest fossils that we have going back, close to over 3 billion years ago, of course, we interpret them as being descended from the same original life event that gave rise to us. But the information preserved in those fossils it's not. I mean, I think that's the most reasonable interpretation. Don't get me wrong, but it is hard to say that that's definitively, that we have a shared answer. I mean, I think that's the most reasonable idea, but it's hard to say. And so much time has gone by. But also it could be that once, and we talk about this a bit in the paper, that once life originated, it actively prevented subsequent origins from happening. And that's something that a lot of other people have talked about in the literature. So this is something we get out in our paper, that just because something happened once, it doesn't necessarily mean that it was so improbable. It could be the first instance of it prevents repeated occurrences. And it could be like that with life, that a second abiogenesis event is actively being prevented by modern life and biogeochemical cycling.
Yeah. Okay, so you're revising the hard steps, so maybe they're easy steps. Okay, then where is everybody?
Yeah.
You wanna kind of review the Fermi Paradox and then give us your answers?
This is where I would normally defer to Jason and Adam, our co-authors, who are astronomers. But essentially, in short, that the universe, there's been plenty of opportunities in space and time for intelligent life, not only to arise, but to traverse the galaxy or the observable universe in a way that would be detectable to us. And yet we have no such observations. So how do you explain that? Where are they? And our co-authors, they wrote a paper on this, that they essentially, the active searching for extraterrestrial intelligence, or now like the search for technosignatures in the atmospheres of planets beyond the solar system, we've barely looked. So to them, it's not surprising we haven't found anything, because we have barely looked. So Jason has gone on to say there is no Fermi paradox. At the same time, I think it's clear we don't live in a sort of Star Trek, Star Wars universe where there's all these spacefaring, beings around. So I think there is still something to explain, but it could just be that's an unrealistic expectation of what advanced life looks like. Like, why should our 20th century science fiction be like a literal roadmap to, where life should go? But I remember when I was an undergrad, I read that Stephen Webb book. Then it was 50 solutions to the Fermi paradox. Oh, yeah. Now he had 75. There are no shortage of explanations, so I don't even think I could come up with an original one. But the view of our co-authors, if I could speak for them, is that there is no Fermi paradox because we've barely started to look.
Yeah. Is that your answer too, Jen?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's analogies with our own scientific evolution. I mean, we know about lots of things on Earth that we never thought we would see at an earlier stage in our own scientific development. And so, it's about how hard you've looked and how long you've looked and in what way you've looked.
Yeah, I mean, there's just the detection of biosignatures in the atmospheres of other planets. I mean, just 20 years ago, this would have been unfathomable. It's just a pure thought experiment. Now, we're just now getting telescopes that can do this, right? So maybe we're just early in the search.
Yep,
that's right.
What I would say.
It's something I find really exciting because I always thought of SETI as just passively receiving, like transmissions from an extraterrestrial civilization, whether they're intending to reach us or not. And what's interesting about the technosignature research is that if we can begin to start characterizing exoplanetary atmospheres in, greater resolution, it's very reasonable to look for atmospheric signatures that are the byproduct of a technological civilization. Like, for example, the presence of chlorofluorocarbons in our atmosphere is indicative of our presence because there are no non-industrial sources of it. So this is a very reasonable idea that there'd be similar signatures in the atmospheres of exoplanets that we're able to characterize. And in this case, we're just observing these civilizations go about their business. They don't have to have radio telescopes. They don't have to be trying to reach us. None of that. And to me, realizing that switch was happening made me more excited about SETI, because it's a lot more than just hoping, we get a radio transmission or something like that.
So the way it works is like, here's our planet, and there's a star out there, and a planet passes it between us and that star. The light from the star passes through the atmosphere of that planet, and then your telescopes can detect molecular structures, and that tell us what the gases are.
Yeah,
right.
The light spectra.
Mm-hmm.
Go on.
Yep, the light from the star passing through the atmosphere is going to selectively absorb certain wavelength bands of light that we can detect by their omission, essentially.
Can I just say that's an astonishing thing that you could even do that?
It is astonishing.
I mean, wow. This is this the James Webb Telescope, or is this another one? Or no, it's the Kepler, right? Or no, I'm getting that confused.
This is outside my area.
Oh,
I know. This is where we need our
the other
co-authors.
Okay.
I think the current observatories are able to do this to a degree and have, but then it's especially the next generation of observatories that are going to be able to do this even to an even greater extent.
Yeah,
and
that's right.
In the meantime, there's a lot of theory trying to figure out, okay, well, if there is a planetary civilization similar to our own on one of these planets that's accessible to us through our observation, what are we looking for? What would be a good technosignature? And this is in the beginning stages, but what makes it so promising is that this technology, if we don't already have it, we're about to have it. And I think that's also why Adam and Jason don't think it's too early to say that there's a Fermi paradox. We just are beginning to apply, to search in this manner. So who knows?
Yeah. So technosignatures could be something like solar panels, a Dyson sphere, or as Avi Loeb likes to push, maybe these technologies have flown through our solar system. A extra, what is it? What's the term for it? Extrastellar object or something like that. Interstellar object. Yeah. But it's again, the evidence for this is so weak. That Oumuamua object that was discovered passing through, apparently accelerating at a rate, but it didn't have any gases coming off of it. So maybe it was like a techno object or a spaceship from another solar system or something like that. The problem is it's gone and we're never going to get it back. And you just have this little data thing of a light signature or something like that. And so he went in search of, maybe objects that crashed in the ocean, this interstellar object that crashed near Papua New Guinea. And he had that expedition there last year. I thought he was going to dredge up the, Millennium Falcon dashboard or something, but
wouldn't that have been cool?
But instead he has these little microspheres, and this is what's always frustrating for me. It's like, it's so hard to say, but what is it exactly? And, most of the people I talk to go, no, those are just industrial waste or something. So then you have to do a chemical analysis of what these things are made out of and how common is that on Earth versus somewhere else. I don't know. We just don't get definitive evidence. Darn it.
Yeah. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof is how it goes.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. So, moving away from the left wall of simplicity, once life gets up and running and evolution is working its magic, what are the other major transitions that are part of the hard steps model that you are revising that maybe are not that hard?
So I'd say after the origin of life itself, the next candidate in time would be the origin of oxygen-generating photosynthesis or oxygenic photosynthesis, which Jen is more of an expert on that than I am. So maybe you want to talk about cyanobacteria and when they arose, or...
Yeah, sure. Right. So worth making it clear that oxygen producing photosynthesis is different than photosynthesis in general. There's lots of photosynthetic microorganisms that harvest light and fix carbon into their biomass without producing any oxygen as a waste product. And so there's a long history of studying the evolution of photosynthetic genes and the evolution of photosynthetic lineages. And it's important to point out that light harvesting is not a single origin transition.
Right.
Like the photosynthesis is found in many different lineages, and it's true that genes for photosynthetic apparatus, light harvesting enzymes, those have been swapped around quite a bit because they're incredibly useful. But photosynthesis is found in many, many different unrelated bacterial lineages. Cyanobacteria appear to be the only organisms, the only lineage that can produce oxygen as a byproduct of their light harvesting. And so this is the explanation for why this might be one of the transitions that's difficult. There are we talk about this in a more detailed way in the paper, and I think I think like many of these transitions, we need to test whether or not they actually are unique, and what the relationship of the timing is between other events that might have made them more or less probable in terms of the environment. So you can imagine a scenario in which you've got all these light harvesting bacteria, you've got plenty of nutrients, and you're running out of things to breathe, because in order to do photosynthesis, you actually have to have something to breathe if you're going to fix CO2. And so in that scenario, there's a selective pressure to be able to breathe something new, and which is exactly what cyanobacteria figured out how to do. They learned how to breathe water, which is never going to run out. And so if you suddenly are able to breathe water, you're going to grow as much as you want, as long as the nutrients are there. And then when the nutrients run out, nobody else is free to evolve that, because you've occupied all those niches. And so this is one explanation of one scenario that is in the category of pulling up the ladder, pulling up the evolutionary ladder, which is one thing that can happen. If you're first to the cheese, you can eat it all before anyone else can figure out how to eat cheese.
That's a great analogy. Dan, you were going to say something?
Yeah, no, and there's a lot of debate as to when oxygenic photosynthesis evolved. Some people think it evolved something like 3 billion years ago, but then some people say, no, it's closer to 2.4 or so, and that's 600 million years. That's 600 million years ago, there were barely animals on the Earth. So it's a long stretch of time. But we know by 2.4, that's when oxygen became a more or less stable feature of the atmosphere, like above trace levels. That's the initial oxygenation of the atmosphere. So the people, especially the people who think oxygenic photosynthesis evolved close to this oxygenation event, it's clear that oxygenic photosynthesis is not one of the very first bacterial metabolisms on Earth. It came later compared to some of the other bacterial metabolisms. And usually, and this is the kind of stuff I get from my colleagues, like at the end of a conference session, they don't explicitly say it in their talks, they don't put it in their papers, but we talk about it. And I think I've talked to people, they think that reflects just the inherent contingency involved in making that work. Because the idea is that to use water as your electron source for this whole process is really chemically difficult, biochemically difficult, and that is just hard for evolution to figure out. And this is a big contrast to how people think in the same field about the origin of animals, for example. Usually it's said animals originated late in Earth history because the environment was unconducive to animal life until, relatively recently in Earth history. they don't usually apply the same logic to cyanobacteria, but there are people in our field who do. But it's very controversial because there are people who reconstruct really hot temperatures for the early Earth. Like, the Earth has always had liquid water, so that's like an upper bound. It can never not support liquid water. But they think it could have been like 70 degrees Celsius or something, like on average at the surface. And if that's true, there are no hyperthermophilic cyanobacteria. So some people think once, there are bacteria who can grow really high temperatures, but the phototrophs are not among them, or cyanobacteria especially are not among them. So they think as the Earth cooled, that controlled when that transition could happen. Of course, a lot of our colleagues don't even like us talking about this because they're convinced the early Earth was mild. But even then, some work recently has shown that the origin of oxygenic photosynthesis may have happened in fresh water, not in the ocean. And it looks like the extent of land above the surface of the ocean, we call this subaerial, below the air. Subaerial landmass was relatively limited on the early Earth, and then that would limit freshwater availability. So as continents grew and became more exposed above the ocean, there would have been more freshwater availability and more opportunities for oxygenic photosynthesis to originate, and maybe that explains the timing and not its inherent improbability. That's the suggestion we put out there.
Yeah.
And I think, Dan, listening to you talk, it makes me want to say, I think one of the strengths of this paper that we wrote is that it highlights some very distinct hypotheses that are testable.
Right.
We just haven't.
Right.
We just have. Geobiology is hard. The rock
really
record
hard.
is incomplete. Genes don't tell all. But we do progress, and if we focus on, looking into some of these hypotheses that are raised in this discussion, we may find answers.
Yeah. Okay. Well, how would you test your hypothesis?
So the way we suggested, if you don't mind,
Go.
one way is to do more studies like this to try to reconstruct the ancestral conditions for this transition. And people are doing this already outside the context of hard steps because it's already interesting and important, even if you don't care about, extraterrestrial life. So, for example, people have done work to try to figure out if it happened in freshwater or in the ocean or the temperatures involved. And we need a more exhaustive list of the required conditions like temperature, salinity, pH, other things like this. And then that comes more from people studying microbial physiology or the evolution of microbial genomes. But then there are people in our field who reconstruct these ancient environments using these rocks and the geochemical signatures they contain. Then we need them to help us reconstruct when those conditions were required. And this is already ongoing, but that's the kind of information we need. What did this transition require with respect to the environment, and when did the environment meet those conditions? And not only does this apply to the origin of oxygenic photosynthesis, the same logic applies to all of these candidate hard steps. Because something Carter imagined that these hard steps had equal probability of happening throughout Earth history, and we know that's not true because Earth's environment has transformed itself so radically that there are long intervals of Earth history where some of these hard step candidates were not viable. The environment did not support them. It's not a coincidence that we find ourselves in the Phanerozoic eon when atmospheric oxygen has never been higher, and not in the Archean atmosphere when the atmosphere was anoxic. That's not a coincidence. That's actually an application of Carter's anthropic reasoning. So we have to apply that reasoning to every hard step in context of Earth's changing surface environment.
Nice. Well, as we come up on an hour here, I want to be mindful of your time, but I don't want to let the subject of intelligence escape. Here's your final paragraph. This could be the dust jacket paragraph for your book. The implications of our proposed alternative to the hard steps model extend well beyond assessing the likelihood of human intelligence on Earth. This framework can be applied to any evolutionary innovation in Earth's past, whether or not the innovation in question led to the origin of H. sapiens. This framework raises the possibility that biospheric evolution generally proceeds in a coarsely deterministic or predictable fashion governed by long-term biospheric trends like increasing habitat diversity in response to unidirectional changes in Earth's surface environment. Not only would these trends and processes apply to Earth throughout time, but their analogs may apply to other inhabited Earth-like worlds in the universe. Yeah. In this sense, not only would the evolutionary origin of H. sapiens be more inherently probable than Carter predicted, but so would the evolutionary origins of human analogs beyond Earth. Okay, so there I think you do need to define intelligence. You sort of punted on that in the early part of the paper, I think, because it's a whole different subject, really. But, I mean, if a simple, I don't know, bacterial-grade organism is moving in the direction of a chemical gradient or toward the light or whatever to solve some particular problem, isn't that a kind of intelligence?
Yes. Yeah, so I would say, and this is something I've never written on, or, I'm not qualified with respect to my research, but in that sense, intelligence is pervasive across the tree of life in that general sense. I guess what we're trying to say is, and we do talk about this because even Carter, what was he trying to explain the origin of? And sometimes he makes it sound like our species, Homo sapiens. Sometimes he makes it sound like a technological civilization, or even just observerhood, beings who are able to reflect on their own origins the way we are now. Like bacteria probably can't do that, but we can. And so there's like an operational approach you could have, like with the search for technosignatures, you could just define it as, beings with a technology that leaves an atmospheric imprint that our instruments can detect. That's a very like pragmatic view. Or like in traditional SETI, it's anything that can build a radio telescope or something. So that kind of bypasses the question and just takes a more, practical approach. But in the sense that you brought up, yeah, I do think intelligence is widespread, but it's hard to put it into words. What is the difference between that kind of intelligence and
Jen?
It's akin to the problems that we've had as human scientists to defining what life is.
Right.
Right. The example of a bacterium going towards the light, that is a response to the environment, and I think that definition of intelligence is probably incomplete, but it does highlight the fact that life fundamentally is something that responds to the environment, right, and reacts to it. Right. And so that's certainly part of a definition of intelligence that I would sanction. There's no universally agreed definition of even life. So imagine the problems defining intelligent life. Right. But a lot of people think they know life when they see it. Yeah. And probably a lot of people would say, yeah, I know intelligence when I see it. Mm-hmm. But when you come right down to it, it's not an easy thing to define.
No.
Yeah. Yeah. Dan, you're going to say something?
No, I agree. And that was something in the paper I tried to avoid. Like, I had to talk about it a bit, but I really think that would require more interdisciplinary effort involving psychologists, anthropologists, neuroscientists, or people who are more well-versed in the evolutionary history of animals. So I think that's something really interesting. And it's actually, I would say, in the history of the hard steps model, it's never really been explicitly looked at. Like amongst astronomers, it's mostly just used in a colloquial or intuitive sense, or this very pragmatic sense, like they have radio telescopes. But this is something that I think this conversation would benefit from, more insight coming from other disciplines to try to formalize this or try to figure out what are we even talking about. We're trying to assess the probability of what exactly.
Yes.
I mean, I think we can say that consciousness, which is that sort of observerhood, ability to reflect on self, that is an area of intense research and considerable progress.
Yeah.
So just like the origin of life or dark matter, consciousness is this area that is, inspires an immense amount of curiosity and scientific research. And so I think those sorts of folks that study consciousness are certainly should be part of that discussion.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I mean, but that's another one of those hard to define. What do you mean conscious?
Yeah.
And it's usually defined as what it's like to be something. Well, how would I know what it's like to be something other than me? Unless I was that object. If I was a bat, I wouldn't be Michael Shermer now realizing what it's like to be a bat. I'd just be a bat.
You'd be
I'd
a
have
bat.
no idea
Yeah.
I'm thinking about this. Right?
Yep. It's a great unknown. There are experts on this who are in all those disciplines Stan named: neuroscience, psychology, anthropology.
Oh, I'll tell you, I've had them all on the show, and they don't have an answer, really. I mean, Christoph Koch just paid David Chalmers a case of wine because they bet 25 years ago last year that the hard problem of consciousness would be solved by 2024, and it wasn't. So
interesting.
He gave up. And
Dan, should we be making bets?
Yeah,
I think we should probably be making bets.
Yeah, you should do that, like Stephen Hawking did with Kip Thorne on the nature of black hole, or I guess it was can radiation escape black holes or something like that. Yeah, that makes it kind of fun. But yeah, the problem again with this intelligence stuff, I back in the day when it was just SETI looking for signals from a technological civilization, I thought, you could get all the way to Neanderthal level intelligence on Earth. And let's say we went extinct instead of the Neanderthals, and they were just still living in Europe making stone tools. They wouldn't be making rocket ships and the internet and television for some other civilization to detect us. They would never know we're here. Now, I suppose with the biosignatures maybe or something like that, they'd know there's life anyway on Earth. But still, you could get all the way to that level, which is a lot.
Right.
Massive brains bigger than ours, and still have no technological spacefaring civilization.
Yeah, absolutely.
No, that's right. No, we probably would. I think Neanderthals, we wouldn't be able to infer their presence from atmospheric spectra. I can't imagine how. But if we could observe them through other means, or actually visit a planet that had something like Neanderthals, even if they weren't making telescopes or spaceships, that would be absolutely amazing. Obviously, I'd be pretty impressed if they're Neanderthals. Though I guess people who advocate for the Great Filter would not like that, because then they mean it's relatively easy to get to that stage, but what's really hard is to get to the next. But in this situation, we're already visiting another planet, so I guess we figured it out. But yeah, these are the sorts of things that it raises.
Yeah. I mean, my answer to the Fermi Paradox is they probably are out there somewhere. It's just a mostly big empty space. It's mostly just nothing between the stars, and so the chances of us finding them or vice versa are just low.
Yeah, that was when I remember reading that Webb book. I think that was his preferred explanation, and I was convinced of it. Also, as a rare Earth advocate, it's just very few inhabited planets make that transition. With this hard subs model, it does predict that. This is the thing. We don't know how common Earth-like planets are. I mean, more than just terrestrial planets in the habitable zone where liquid water is stable, but also planets that are able to accommodate the sorts of surface trends that we have been talking about, like they're capable of atmospheric oxygenation, or they have active plate tectonics like we have on Earth. They have the physical properties need to be compatible with this sort of environmental and biological evolution. And it could be that once you have, and as the early Earth was, planets with similar starting conditions, once they originate and have life, maybe this sort of biospheric trajectory is common, but it could be that those sorts of Earth-like planets are really rare. And that would then still explain the Fermi Paradox. Even on the few cases where life does originate on these planets, they might evolve something like Neanderthals eventually. But even then, they're not going to come and visit us, or we're not going to see them anytime soon.
Yeah. Well, that was a question Robert Wright brought up in his book, Non-Zero. He argued for an inevitability in evolutionary progress. And if it wasn't us, it would have been Neanderthals. If it wasn't Neanderthals, it would have been Homo erectus. If it wasn't them, it would have been chimps or gorillas. I don't really see it that way. I think that's two directionality for evolutionary theory to support, but it's an interesting idea.
Yeah, I heard.
So I think you can.
Go on.
I think you can put that thought into this model of what life does. It's essentially it's a definition of life. Life explores niche space. Life explores the space available for living in the environment. And if humans, Homo sapiens, had not pushed Neanderthals out, what space would that species have explored?
Right.
Given the time.
Okay, that's a good point.
I think it's not.
Yeah.
I think it's not crazy.
Yeah.
To me, that sounds actually kind of reasonable.
Okay.
Yeah.
Nice.
Personally, if we were to go extinct right now, I don't necessarily think like Charlie Lineweaver called this the Planet of the Apes idea. Like if we go extinct, chimps are going to immediately fill in this vacant space. I don't know if I necessarily believe that, but let's say the biosphere has another billion years of supporting the sorts of conditions that exist now. Even if all primates go extinct, in the next billion years, could there be another tetrapod lineage, another vertebrate, land-dwelling vertebrate that can evolve comparable technology in that time? I'm actually more open-minded about that possibility than I was before. And I also agree we can't rule that out. I don't think it has to be, again, primates or chimps immediately, but in the next billion years, it could be a different lineage, exploring the same niche. And again, it only needs to be a couple lineages. It's not all lineages are trying to fill in that space. That's not how it works. But you don't need all lineages to fill in that space for it to happen again. So I'd be more optimistic if we went extinct that something like us would appear before the Earth becomes completely sterile.
Remember Dale Russell, the paleontologist who projected that bipedal spear-carrying, tool-using dinosaur? I think that was back in the 80s.
Is that where, like, I think I've seen pictures of this.
Yeah.
It's Simon Kaiwe Morris, I think, sometimes uses it in his talks. It's like this lizard person. Yeah. Right. And maybe, I don't know. And lizards, and this is interesting, like what clades or groups of organisms would be more conducive to this? Like, would it have to be a mammal or a bird? Can reptiles even do that? I mean, I guess...
Oh, we are reptiles. Let's just be clear.
Reptiles actually, or birds are reptiles. Yeah, there's reptiles are not a natural group. Yeah, we're fish. These aren't clades. Right. So, I don't know, but it raises these sorts of questions. Which lineages would be good candidates, or what traits do these lineages need to have in order to make a transition like that? And I don't think we really know, or at least I don't know. Maybe people are working on that.
Yeah. Well, I think these are early days in what you're doing. Right. I mean, it's probably centuries away from really having a full understanding. Like maybe we're in Newton's time or Galileo's time for physics, and 400 years later, it's going to be very different.
Right.
It's a hard problem.
Hope. Yes.
Yeah, way harder than physics, I think.
I have heard Simon Kaiwe Morris wrote that biology is kind of like where physics was before Einstein, and then biology is awaiting its Einstein analog that's going to put biology in completely new territory, which is an interesting thought.
I don't think there's going to be an Einstein because it takes too many kinds of expertise these days to progress.
Yeah.
So I think it's going to be an Einstein collaborative.
Yeah, a group of Einsteins. Yeah.
One of those papers with 300 co-authors.
Yeah, that's going to do it. Yeah.
Or at least 4.
At least 4. That's right. Like your paper. All right, guys. Thank you so much. That was really super interesting. I'll hit the stop button there.
Thanks for having us. This was fun.
Thank you.
That was really good. Such a great topic.